Good morning, it's Richard Pears from Finextra TV, and good to have James Lockhart Smith back with us today after our Sustainable Finance Live series last week. James, of course, is the VP of Markets and Applied Risk at Maplecroft. Good to see you today. How are you?
Very well, Richard, and thanks very much for the opportunity last week and then another chance to speak again this morning.
Well, you know, it's a privilege to have you guys on there. Of course, we're talking about risk, and as a sort of preeminent player in that area, we very much valued having you on board to sort of steer us in the right direction. Tell us, you know, coming into the event, though, you know, I was a stranger phoning you up out of the blue saying, let's do this thing. What were your expectations? What were you hoping to contribute and achieve?
Well, I think, you know, one driver was to learn from what's clearly a very diverse group of experts, as well as participate in the emerging community represented in this event. And then I suppose we also thought that, you know, Verisk Maplecroft's own standpoint on sustainability-based risks that are related in some way to the spatial context of an asset would be useful and appropriate to bring to bear. So we've been working for over a decade on these kinds of concerns in a corporate and investor context. You know, what are your asset level exposure to climate, natural hazard, political risk, so on and so forth. So, you know, I think we felt there we had a contribution to make. It's kind of second nature for us to see sustainability and risk in spatial terms and try to find solutions to our clients' challenges that arise from using data in that context. And for a long time, you know, I guess most of the financial sector, to the extent it thought about sustainability, was doing that from a non-spatial perspective. So what are the company level data points related to ESG policy disclosures and KPIs? So it's been really interesting to see the emergence of this sort of community that shares our perspective in many ways. And so it was natural for us to want to be part of the debate. And I think, you know, it's also about, frankly, just the urgency of finding solutions fast. I think, you know, we can disagree on whether coronavirus has been a temporary distraction or an accelerant, but, you know, we're heading into 2021 and the climate emergency is going to loom larger than ever. We're also seeing irreversible harms to the natural environment despite increased investor engagement and governmental activism. You know, you could just look at what's been happening in the Amazon this year, for example. So, you know, what's our responsibility and that of others in the space to contribute to facilitating the kind of system level changes we need? I think that was also a driver for us.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, given that you are an authority on this area, with the group that we had, what do you actually feel, you know, if you will, that you were learning from collaborating with that group, or were you really, you know, largely helping them to understand the experience you have?
Oh, no, there was a huge amount to learn. You describe us very generally. I think we do the best we can to understand and quantify risk, present decision useful data and research, but it's impossible to overstate the importance of learning from others. You know, this might look like a fairly specialized field from the outside, but actually in the group you had represented, there was a very diverse collection of individuals, you know, representing most areas of sort of the sustainability markets ecosystem, including in particular sub areas, which, you know, may be different from ours. So it's incredibly valuable to expose oneself and ourselves corporately to that kind of learning. I'll give you an example. I mean, most of the work we do is with the buy side, with asset managers and asset owners, at least in relation to the investor side of our work. So it was a real education to me to interact with counterparts on the risk session who came from the banking and risk-weighted asset perspective, to be able to learn about integrating sustainability concerns there, just to give you an example.
Yeah. So if people missed it and they're going, whoa, hang on a minute, I haven't got the time to sort of go back through the videos, which are all available online. But, you know, what were the three things that you would want to leave from what you brought to the party, and three things that perhaps you learned?
I guess, yeah, it's a really good question. I suppose three aspects of my input might be as follows. So firstly, integrating the spatial dimension of risk into financial decision making across the buy side and across capital markets in general is eminently possible. It is possible, you know, most obviously in relation to physical climate change risk, but also really all areas of sustainability. So pretty much every aspect of E, S, or G has some sort of context driven or spatial element to it, even if markets are traditionally attuned to thinking in terms of more decontextualized corporate KPIs. So to give you an example, if I look at a mining asset, the likelihood of the asset causing harm through water abstraction or the project falling into conflict with local communities over water use. It can't really be inferred from learning whether the parent company has a relevant policy. It also can't be inferred from learning the water efficiency metrics of that asset. I also need to factor in the level of local water stress or abundance. So, I guess we've thought that way for quite a long time, but I just wanted to underscore that, that is totally possible and appropriate. Secondly, and I guess, points 2 and 3 here, really factoring in these considerations requires progress in 2 areas. So the first and most obvious is in relation to asset data, which we talked about in one of the sessions. And I would also say here that mapping the universe of corporate assets to geographical risks and doing that to an acceptable degree of precision is also totally possible. The data is out there in various places, even if it hasn't been sort of fully daisy chained together. And I say to an acceptable degree of precision because to build broad solutions, we need to not let the best be the enemy of the good. There is a role here for perfect corporate locational data sets where they exist, but there's also a role for data science and GIS-driven approaches, which are about inferencing and about estimation and kind of accepting, working out to a certain degree that everybody is happy with, that a certain company is operating in a certain area doing certain things. That kind of data will come before the perfect disclosed data. And then the last point from my side, I guess, would be, we're accustomed to thinking the main problem is a lack of data, but a lack of understanding of what sort of spatial data is relevant or asset level data is relevant and why it's relevant can also undermine progress. So you'll hear a lot of people talk about asset level data as a big bundle of sort of uniform, data with uniform attributes. But, a company or its assets are exposed as the recipients of risk to things like physical climate change, natural hazards, or political disruption. They also have the potential to cause positive or negative impacts on their surrounding environment. So when you take that perspective into the domain of spatial data, we're actually talking about 3 different types of asset level data. I guess there's data on the KPIs or performance of a specific asset affecting the local environment. So, for example, that could be emissions from a factory. There's also then data on the external location that's contextually relevant to how the asset might affect the local environment. So, for example, my previous example on water stress. So that's data from outside the asset, but it's relevant to that asset level impact. And then there's data on the external location that affects vulnerability to disruption or damage. So things like physical climate change risk. So those are all different categories of data, and they kind of need to be handled a bit differently. So what were my takeaways? I guess the field is still in a state of sort of emergence, and there's loads to do, but the will and the interest is definitely there. And I think everybody has this sort of renewed sense of urgency. I wouldn't say yet post coronavirus, but as we draw into the sort of the vaccine era. Secondly, I think solutions that integrate spatial and sustainability data properly into capital markets are going to be achieved, yes, through a mix of academic, NGO, and government leadership, but also close continued involvement by the private sector in terms of data analytics, with plenty of, even where there's plenty of room for collaboration on things like standards, as we can go into between entities who are essentially competitive in many senses. I mean, I don't want to go full Adam Smith here, but implicit in the idea of an ecosystem and an optimal ecosystem that we talk about is one of multiple participants trying to achieve the best outcomes for their clients. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that, and I think it does coexist with solving the climate emergency and sustainability challenges in general as a public good. It just needs to be managed in an appropriate fashion with leadership from non-commercial actors. And then thirdly, there are some very actionable, becoming less abstract, there are some very actionable next steps that we can look at early next year.
Yeah, I mean, a fantastic summary of a lot of things that we discussed, and we were just chatting about the Reith lectures before it started, where he sort of unpicks that Adam Smith bit in the context of sort of social norms and needs. Final question, really. I mean, we discussed a lot of this stuff, and if you could sit there and go, wow, there was a lot of challenges, a lot of issues, a lot of a lot of solutions. We've got a lot of that down. I mean, what do you think we, in a nutshell, we achieved, and what should we do next? Because we still have got a lot of work to do.
So what did we achieve? I think implicit in my earlier answer was that there was a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas between the various participants. We all come with these different perspectives and sub-specializations. So I came out of this having absorbed a lot, which I can then take away. And I think the same was the case for the other participants. And in the same way, the wider audience also had the opportunity to listen to a group of specialists discussing problems and opportunities, areas to work together in a fairly sort of live and unfiltered way. And that's fairly different from, the approach in traditional sustainability conferences, where it's more about individuals or individual organizations coming in, delivering their pitch, and then going away again, rather than trying to work together. Now, the format we use to get that quality of interaction, which very adeptly brought together, was one of a product workshop of the kind that we're more used to seeing behind closed doors within a single organization. And that invites the question, can the emerging community represented in this group begin to collaborate and support the sort of system level changes that are going to facilitate transition towards a more sustainable economic system, despite coming from all these different organizations? And I think the answer is definitely yes, even though some of us have commercial mandates. I guess I'd focus on two fairly clear takeaways for next steps in the near term. And this was a point I think I made before in one of our previous discussions. There's a clear and urgent need for assimilating spatial and asset level disclosures into the process of consolidation, which I'm fairly confident we're now going to see happening on the corporate ESG data front. So we've seen, SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and another entity announce their merger, broader collaboration afoot with the GRI and other bodies, broader accounting standards entities beginning to think about this. So for the first time, you can see not a fragmented landscape ahead, but a stable and consistent set of corporate ESG reporting standards. So this is a window of opportunity for us that, we could miss. If that consolidation completes, and then the spatial community is like, oh, hang on, what about asset level data? That's not going to be so effective. So I think bringing these considerations forward, now is really pretty important. Secondly, there's also an opportunity for all of us to work together on sketching out what a universal shared taxonomy of data standards and structures could look like. And I think that includes maybe an open symbology of, identifiers that we're accustomed to seeing in sort of pinned to securities of different types, because that's going to be key in facilitating the creation of an effective data marketplace and integrating asset level data in the way we've been discussing. So we need to think about that, what it looks like, what those standards are, and also how it could be administered and managed if it's not just by one private entity which decides it's going to try and capture the whole thing for itself. I think that also means bringing in some of the requisite expertise to think through the privacy and technical aspects of this. So in other words, how can you protect the confidentiality and the IP of all participants in this kind of marketplace? So that those interests can be protected. And also maybe to enable disclosure and delivery of this kind of data in a way that's commensurate with this data being a public good. And by that, I mean that this is the sort of data which is appropriate, has a very significant commercial value for some entities in the ecosystem, and then maybe for other types of stakeholder or non-governmental groups, maybe it's appropriate to make certain categories of that data or that data in a limited context more available, at a much less or very, very little commercial cost or no commercial cost, right?
Yeah.
So I think through effective technology, you can achieve that sort of balance.
Fantastic. James, I think tour de force, really, you've called everything that we discussed really beautifully there. Well done. Thanks for working with us. We look forward to working with you in 2021. So for now, James, thanks again. See you soon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Richard. See you soon. Bye-bye.